Thanks for joining us. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Written Information Security Programs. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Joining us is Scott Giordano, VP of Data Protection at Sperian. Scott's a highly regarded data privacy attorney with over 20 years of experience. Also joining us is Jana White, COO of Alpine Security. Jana provides a holistic approach to security, facilitating cost-effective security control analysis based on assessed risk. Welcome, Scott and Jana. Please take it away.
Thank you, Abby. Welcome, everyone, to the call here. So I'm going to just summarize what I think that is important for all of you to leave with if you leave with nothing else, and Jana is definitely going to weigh in on this. First up is that many jurisdictions require written information security programs or written information security plans. Sometimes you'll see them called different things, but it's the same idea. Many are also requiring written plans for incident response or breach notification. Some are requiring for secure disposal or destruction of personal information or sensitive information. And more are requiring third-party evaluations. And more importantly, more of these are coming. Also, risk assessments are key in developing any plan or other documentation. And I would dare say that if a third party, for example, showed you their plan but wouldn't show you their risk assessment, I'd be very dubious as whether the risk assessment, or I'm sorry, the plan itself has a lot of value. And certainly, Jana, you'll weigh in a little bit in this later. And then finally, some key elements. Some of these are familiar to you, policies, procedures. I include plans in there like breach notification plans. But most importantly, acceptance by upper management. Again, if your plan does not have acceptance by upper management and it's not signed off on, then I question its validity. And I'll give you an example. When I was working on data protection impact assessments, which is a species of risk assessment for the run-up to GDPR, I found that in many cases there were sign-offs by the CISO, by the GC, by the DPO, and that really added a lot of weight to the plan. And it really changed the dynamic from something that was just an exercise to something that was very powerful. So I'm going to do a full stop there. Jana, comments or questions about anything that the audience should leave with?
Yeah, I think that one of the key takeaways here is when we're talking about this written documentation that you have to prove that you have compliance with WISP requirements, it's not enough just to have the policies and procedures without, as Scott said, the management buy-in to accept the risk for the organization, but also training for your personnel so that you can prove you're following your own policies and procedures within your organization. You have to provide some indication that it's not just documentation that's filed away on your intranet. It is your information security program that is up and running within your organization.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to dig a little deeper into this. So let's talk about the WISP just in and of itself. Over the last 14 or so months, maybe 15 months now, at least 9 states have passed laws requiring you to have a WISP. Now, what's the total? This was a question that someone emailed me in advance. I'm guessing it's about 34, maybe 35. It depends how you slice it. Does that mean the other states and other jurisdictions don't have that requirement? Not necessarily. They may have pieces of it, such as a written requirement for a secure disposal. So just keep that in mind. Just because there's about 34, 35 I've found doesn't mean that there's not more lurking out there. Also, I've been asked, Scott, can you provide a comprehensive list? And the answer is, that's a project I'm working on. I will share that with you, the audience, as soon as it's done. It's a pretty big undertaking. Also note that not all of them use the word written. Sometimes they'll use the word documented. Sometimes they won't use either word, but they'll tell you to do a plan, and the implication is that you've got to be written. You couldn't memorize the whole thing, presumably. So whether it says written or not, odds are it's written. Also, some of the things that are interesting is that even if it doesn't necessarily say written, a lot of times they're asking for an incident response or breach notification plan. They want a safe destruction or safe disposal plan. I've heard them call that for personal data. Sometimes they're asking you to impose your requirements on third parties. And really, this is probably a bigger takeaway than I think we all appreciate, is that third parties are the weak link in the chain in any of these laws we're about to go through. If third parties don't have their ducks in a row, then it's going to come back to haunt you. And also, more of these laws are on the way. So even if we're not up to 50 right now, more are coming. I'm happy to say Washington State, my home state, has the Washington Privacy Act that's going through the legislature right now, almost certainly to get passed. So it'll be their version of CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act. I know New York and New Jersey have their versions in the legislature, and more are on the way. By the end of the year, we may have another half dozen copies of CCPA, perhaps more. Before I go on, Janet, comments or questions or thoughts about that?
I definitely think that if your organization has some components of these written documents, you need to make sure that they meet the requirements, but you also want to identify those gaps or those areas where you're missing that written component, whether it's like as you state, a breach notification plan or safe disposal procedures for your organization, because if you're ever audited for compliance, what they're going to be auditing against are those artifacts. That's why it has to be captured in written form, right? Because you're either going to have it and provide it to the auditor or you're not. So if you're looking through your own policies and procedures or your documentation to see how you stack up against the latest regulations that have come down, you basically want to identify where you're missing documentation first and get that written as quickly as possible to make you compliant.
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you. Let's do the next slide here, and we'll dig right into the original WISP, if you want to call it that. And
Scott,
that is,
before we move to the next slide, we have a question on this one.
Sure.
Is a DFARS SSP, System Security Plan, sufficient for an information security program?
Yes, it is, and we're going to cover, I'm so happy that someone mentioned that, and I did not pay them, by the way, to mention that. I'm a big fan of DFARS, so yes, SSPs, we're going to cover that, and yes, they are sufficient. They're massive undertakings. If anyone's not seen an SSP, I recommend it. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you.
All right, let us dig in. Yes, 201 CMR 17. I imagine the bulk of you on this call have seen this floating by your desk at some point in the last 10 years, because it's about 10 years old or so. And this is the original WISP, and it was a great way to kick things off. It really, in many ways, helped solidify information security as a serious discipline and not just a checkbox item. So let's dig in a little bit deeper. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about this and the risk assessment piece of it. So 201 CMR 17, this is from Massachusetts, and what does it ask? It asks that everyone that either owns or licenses personal information about a resident of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, by the way, shall develop, implement, and maintain a comprehensive information security program that is written. Okay, there you go. There's your WISP. And then it gives you some criteria that you have to consider that I won't dig into. You've probably all seen it by now. So what's interesting is that a lot of times in vendor contracts, you will see 201 CMR 17 cited. The vendor is being in compliance, or it's asking you to be in compliance, or it's asking someone else in the supply chain to be compliant. And if you go to the next slide, it also talks about, wonder of wonders, risk assessment. Here we go. Every WISP shall include identifying, assembling reasonably foreseeable internal and external risks. So again, there's your risk assessment. So what you're going to find as a theme of this presentation, and probably many more that we'll be doing, is that risk assessment and WISPs all travel together. And Jen, let me ask you, what's your assessment? I imagine that you've run into the requirement risk assessments over the past 10 years with 201 CMR or other ones. What's been your experience?
Well, it depends on the organization and what industry it's in. In the case of HIPAA compliance, we have a lot of clientele that are used to compiling this documentation because they have considerable fines that could be levied against them, and they're used to having HIPAA audits. And as part of that, it incorporates a healthy assessment process in there. They do pen tests every quarter, they do vulnerability assessments, so they do have this program fully fleshed out. Other industries that don't have those same regulations may not be as quickly able to catch up to requirements like this because they've not looked at risk throughout their organization as a whole before. So if your organization is one of those, and this is your first time really sort of sitting down and saying, we need to comply with these new requirements or requirements that maybe we haven't paid enough attention to in the past, and we need to do risk assessments, you want to look at it from every level within your organization, at the organization level, at whatever your business unit level is, and certainly all the way down to the information systems themselves, paying particular attention to the data that moves through your systems, how you store it, where you transmit it, how you create it, what type of data you hold.
Excellent. Let's take a look at another statute, which I think is important. Actually, it's a regulation. This is NYCRR Part 500. So this is promulgated by New York's Department of Financial Services, And you might say, well, wait, Scott, I'm not a financial services entity. This doesn't really apply to me. Well, it may not. But here's what's interesting about this is this really gives at least 4 areas where a written document is required. In many ways, it's a great template. If you have never started one of these, this is a great template. So here, section 03, a recovered entity, okay, so financial services entity, shall implement and maintain a written policy or policies for protection of information systems and information. And I like this because this approach is very much like the federal government does, where they say, we're protecting not just the systems, but the information on the system. Sometimes there was confusion about what you're supposed to be protecting. Here it just comes out and says, yes, you're protecting both. So that's great. And of course, it requires a risk assessment. Good for them. It's always important to have that while you're doing this. So you've got the requirement of a policy. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll see other things that this regulation requires. So application security, you need a written procedures, guidelines, and standards, okay, to ensure the secure development practices of in-house applications. I'm not familiar with a lot of jurisdictions going down to this level of detail where they're asking for the development life cycle to have security baked into it. That's exactly what you're doing here with procedures, guidelines, and standards. So this is really granular. This is great. So it's great that we're seeing application security addressed finally. We go to the next slide. Now there's a risk assessment. And this is a common theme, folks. We're seeing risk assessments here throughout this discussion. So here it's talking about every covered entity shall do a risk assessment sufficient to inform the design of the cybersecurity program, and it's carried out in accordance with written policies and procedures and shall be documented. I mentioned earlier about looking for the word documented. So Janet, thoughts about this in relation to NYC Part 500? This is for financial services, which actually is a lot broader than people realize. We have a whole webinar just on Part 500, but what are your thoughts about this?
Well, on the slide previously when we were talking about application development, it's not just something else that organizations have to consider as, oh, okay, now we have to add this to everything else we're doing. This benefits the organizations greatly. As you pointed out, if you start with thinking about security first at the application level, at the software development level and the system development level, it's much more cost effective to implement security measures there when it's baked in than later when you've got to bolt it on as an afterthought, certainly. So it does benefit your organization to start thinking about risk and about security from the very, very beginning fundamental parts of what you do. And with risk assessments, as you do these throughout the organization, and you make any changes to your IT staff and your structure and your internal policies and the technology that you use to protect your systems, certainly updating those risk assessments lets you know whether you're still in the same risk tolerance level that you want to be in, and helps provide cost-effective measures for you to meet compliance with regulations like this.
Excellent. Let's do the next slide, see what else we have here. So third parties, you knew that it was going to come down to third parties. So third parties shall implement written policies and procedures. So I mentioned in the introduction that if anything was going to go wrong, it was probably going to be a third party. And so a common theme of the last 15 months or so of new regulations and new statutes is this idea that you have to police your third parties. And before it was just a good idea, now it's the law. And so here we're finding this. Well, we found this already for those of you that are involved in the defense industry, and the DFARS supplement we had to address last year. The whole supply chain comes into play here about getting them to certify compliance. This is something that you're going to be seeing everywhere, and this is just a great example of it. Let's go to the next slide. So incident response plan. What's interesting about this is that they're calling out a separate requirement for an incident response plan. So in some cases, it's implied that you're going to have an incident response plan as part of your security posture. Here, it's just coming out and saying, look, you need a written incident response plan. What would have been ideal, in my view, is also they would have had a breach notification plan they would have called out separately. And here's why. There's a lot of presumption that, oh, if I have an IR plan, I have a breach notification plan, and it's not the case. IR plans tend to be focused on battling the bad guys and getting them out of your network and all those things. Breach notification plans is more about responding to it, or working with the authorities, getting the people who were affected notified, all those things. I did a post-mortem discussion. In fact, I'm doing one today at RSA about this very subject. And in some cases, when people get hacked, they were waiting up to a year to notify people who were affected. And by that time, the horse is out of the barn. So I think that if they were to update this statute or this regulation, having a written breach notification plan would be ideal. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you are spot on there, Scott. One of the things that we think of when we think of incident response is we do think of, hey, there's somebody now in our network and there's a team actively fighting to remove that threat from your network. But when it comes to data breach, we still measure the time that organizations notice their data breach in hundreds of days. So it's a lot different if you've had someone who's been in and out of your network for the past 183 days and you've just now determined that there's actually a breach. Like as you stated, the horse has left the barn a long time ago, right? So we need to get better and faster at identifying and preventing data breaches, and that really needs to come down to legislation that sort of moves the bar for everybody to catch up.
Excellent. Let's talk about defense, and here's why. We'll go to the next slide. And DFARS 7812, NIST INT 171. Those of you not in the defense industry, this is something that I would really take a hard look at. And I say that because it provides a great model. DFARS, by the way, is Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. So it's the buying rules that DoD uses for contracting. And what's interesting, it's not a regulation. Contrary to popular belief, it's not a regulation, it's not a statute, it's nothing. It's a requirement for purchasing of anything via DoD. So they have the power to say, these are the things you're going to do. And one of the things they're doing is requiring you to conduct a risk assessment. Imagine that. So this is the idea that we're protecting controlled unclassified information, CUI. So maybe you are working in a part of a defense program. You have information that's not classified as confidential, top secret, have you, but it's still things that could harm the U.S. if it escapes. Well, you have to be able to assess the risk to the organization and make sure that you're addressing that. So this is something that's very important, and it's not surprisingly required of contractors. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that there's a security requirement, and someone mentioned this earlier. This is a security requirement for NIST Special Publication INT 171. This is confidentiality, great publication, by the way, and it requires you to develop, document, and update periodically a system security plan. What's a system security plan? It's a WISP, but just bigger, for lack of a better phrase. And I have colleagues that have developed these. They're big projects. They take a long time, but I would recommend everyone on the call here to go Google one and try and find one and have a look at it. You're going to see how a WISP writ large looks. And this is something that is crucial for meeting DoD standards, and it's something that I would take a hard look at as a model for yourself. I may not necessarily be recommended for everyone, but it's a great idea to look at and see how others are doing things. And full stop there. Again, any comments or thoughts? I don't know if you've run into DoD requirements or not in your tenure.
Yeah, we do. And we do recommend the NIST documentation quite a lot, not only to our clients that are part of sort of the federal system, but also to clients who just want a starting place or want some guidance that is incredibly detailed on how to do this. If you don't know how to do a risk assessment, there is a NIST document that will walk you through every step of the way. If you're doing, developing a system security plan and you don't know how to do that, there is NIST guidance for that. So it's certainly available to anybody and everybody. And while it is incredibly detailed, we're talking, 180, 200 pages on average for a NIST document, it will provide you a complete picture of everything that could be done. Now, your organization may choose to take parts of that and use that and maybe not follow the entire thing, but it does give you a place to start. So if we're talking about these kind of concepts and you're like, man, I don't even know how to do a risk assessment, this is a great reference for you to turn back to and take a look at.
Excellent. Thank you. So GDPR, so you didn't think that we were going to have a discussion without GDPR here. Does GDPR require a risk assessment? Yes, it does. Here's the funny thing is they don't come out and use the phrase risk assessment, though. What they say under Article 32, which I recommend you all read, is taking into account the state of the art, the cost, nature, scope, blah, 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 as well as the risk of likelihood. So they don't use the word risk assessment, but that's where they're demanding a risk assessment. And they talk about the controller and the processor, so the primary organization that has the personal data and the processor, the third parties, essentially, shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. To us, that is administrative controls, that's technical controls, okay, as appropriate. And then it gives you a list of things to consider. And if we go to the next slide, they do a good job of going into the weeds. So we'll talk about pseudonymization, which is just tokenization, is what we would call it over here. They talk about the ability to ensure confidentiality, integrity, availability, which we're all familiar with. They also talk about resilience. So the ability of your network, of your information system to withstand abuse. Sometimes people confuse this with availability. It's not availability. It's being able to take a punch and still continue your mission. So this is something that presumably you're going to have to factor in now into your risk assessment. So it's interesting how these all work together. It also talks about mechanisms for testing and assessing and evaluating. Well, that's another citation to a risk assessment. And Jan, I'm going to come back to you here. So for multinational security requirements, how do you apply risk assessments? Do you do it in the same manner that we do it here in the US? Are there other considerations? How would you approach this?
Normally, if we've got multinational requirements, or especially when we throw GDPR into the mix, right now it is sort of the gold standard and the hardest one to achieve full compliance because it is very, very granular. It's got the 99 articles and about 400 controls mentioned within those articles that you need to make sure you're complying with. So we always say go for the top bar, because if you hit that, you're going to comply with anybody else underneath it. And follow a standardized testing procedure that is usually conducted by an independent third party that will hold up to most of these requirements, like GDPR. When they look at it, they want to see somebody who's trained to do the testing, providing you with the right results so that you can remediate anything you need to on your end, and is giving you guidance on how to continue to be compliant or to get to compliance if you're not quite there yet.
Okay. Well, while we're talking about risk, let's go and talk about it from 30,000 feet. And I'm going to ask you to take the lead here and give us the big picture about risk assessments, because some of our attendees here may do them informally, but really may not know about all the different flavors of risk assessments. So do you want to take the lead on this?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about risk assessments, mainly we're talking about looking at risk throughout your entire enterprise. And that's where you really have to go in and do things like business impact assessments on every single process that you have and what systems that process depends on and the business units themselves, and sort of prioritize what is most important to our organization, what keeps our lights on, and what do we need to have in operation that we can't live without. Otherwise, our business would not be able to stay in business. And when you do an enterprise risk assessment, you're going to come up with almost overwhelming amount of information that you have to rank in order of criticality and how we're going to handle it. And again, that goes back to each organization determining what is critical for them to function. There's all the other types of risk assessments that are part of a holistic enterprise-wide risk assessment. We've got security risk assessments. We're looking at things like our physical security measures that we take, things that we put into place as far as technical controls go to provide security to our systems, to the data contained or running on our systems. Privacy risk assessments are very big and very important for your organization because it always goes back to the data. Whether we're creating it, whether we're transmitting it, whether we're storing it, we have to look at the impact of what type of data we have and what happens if this is lost or stolen from us, right? So we look at privacy impact assessments. How does this impact the regulations and requirements that we have to protect the privacy of the individual's data that we hold or we transmit? And if you do business with individuals, you're collecting that kind of data. So you have to handle it appropriately. And data protection impact assessments, as Scott mentioned earlier, this is really where we're talking about when we're processing data. And if we are using processing techniques that we're going to store data or handle the data or anything, we need to make sure that we're still preserving the CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that data. We're ensuring that data is not going to be compromised as part of our processes. And finally, one of the ones that I would say is one of the most important to your organization, and often one that I see is most overlooked, is legal risk assessments. Going over those service level agreements we have and the contractual agreements we have with our vendors, with our third parties, even ones that we write ourselves to deliver to our clients. If we're not constantly having someone in a legal capacity review that and make sure it is fully in compliance, we can slowly drift out of compliance without even realizing it. Scott, what are your thoughts on that one? Because I consider that one really, really critical and one that often does not get as much attention as it deserves.
It doesn't. And in fact, when I was working on GDPR projects, one of the things that was striking to me was that a lot of my clients didn't even have a contract manager, didn't know where all their contracts was just asking for trouble because in theory, these supply chain members all have to adhere to GDPR. So they didn't know where the contracts were, didn't know what was required of them and of the third party, didn't have any visibility. I talked to one privacy officer who's an attorney that didn't have any contracts and said, oh, it was another attorney's responsibility. And I thought, wait a minute. So you don't know all these contracts? Guess what happens? If anything goes wrong, you can bet 9 times out of 10 it's going to be a third party that's going to be creating the problem. And 1 time out of 10 it's going to be an internal vulnerability. And I was really struck by it. So I guess the lesson from this is, if you do nothing else after you leave this webinar, is go get legal involved and find out, hey, what are our legal obligations or those of our third parties? Because if anything's going to bite us, it's likely going to be that.
Absolutely, and you really can't afford not to do it anymore, because it does risk a significant amount of damage to your branding if your vendors or your third parties are how data is breached within your organization. Most people think of the Target hack and still get a little mad because they had to get a new card, but it wasn't actually Target that was the source of the breach. It was a vendor, right? But nobody cares about that part. They only think of Target. So it actually damaged the brand for the company, and so you definitely want to make sure, if, as Scott said, nothing else comes out of this whole thing, is definitely have legal review all of your contracts and look at them not only for the service level that is being provided, but really look at how they protect data. And if you don't feel comfortable with the way your data may be moving into their systems, then you may need to look for another vendor or another third party. And we can go to the next slide here. So let's talk a quick second about risk. When we're talking about doing these risk assessments, especially if this is relatively new to you or your organization, you want to understand what risk actually is. And it's basically, in its simplest form, the formula of likelihood times impact. What is the likelihood of this threat occurring or this vulnerability being exploited? And then how bad is it going to hurt if that actually happens? And you calculate this sort of likelihood times impact formula so that you can get that criticality ranking for each and every risk within your organization, so that you can prioritize which ones need the most attention and certainly the most money being thrown at them, or which ones maybe you're willing to just accept. We all remember days when banks used to chain the pins to the counter, right? But they realized that the cost of the chain was more than the cost of the pin in many cases. So now they're willing to let people walk off with the pins. They buy cheaper pins and they put their logo on it, and now it's free advertising, right? That's a risk that they were gladly willing to accept because the cost of protecting the pin was too great. So we definitely want to make sure everybody understands the reason we need to know what risk is and how we're going to use that information to develop a risk assessment strategy and moving forward in our organization, how we're going to handle risk. And on the next slide, we can go to the next one. This is from another NIST document, 800-30, that talks all about risk assessment. So this is a good one if you really want to dig into risk assessment. This is an excellent document for you to take a look at. But you have to decide what risk means to your organization and what your sort of risk tolerance level is, and frame everything you do from that perspective. So how you assess risk, how you respond to it, what kind of controls you're going to put into place, and then how you're going to monitor those controls all depend on your unique organizational needs. And we can go to the next slide. So we talked a little bit about incident handling earlier. There is a NIST guide as well for that in case you want to look at developing a strong incident handling plan and process for your own organization. That's 800-61. It's on its second revision. But within your organization, it's not just enough to say, okay, I'm going to create a policy and a procedure document for incident handling. This also requires you to have trained personnel on your staff. They may have to hold certain certifications, or they may have to have had so many hours of training, and they practice incident response over and over so that they are ready and prepared, much like firefighters, to jump in when needed. So the preparation step for incident handling is a considerably important step. It's not just about responding to something, it's about being prepared on the front end and making sure we have lessons learned that we're capturing on the back end so that we can continue to improve the security of our organization as a whole. Any questions on standing up a good incident handling process? Certainly refer to this. On the next slide, if we go to that next one, we can take a look at, this is a sample checklist from that guide, right? So you can literally map out everything you need to do for each phase of the incident handling. But are there any other questions maybe on standing up an incident handling program within your own organization?
We did receive a few. One of them, should all employees go through training every year?
Yes, absolutely. And not just on security awareness training, but if they are responsible for any of these things like incident handling, or they are responsible for being part of the security team, they should have specialized training for that as well. At least annually is usually the requirement, but the more often the better. Anytime you suffer a phishing attack or anything like that, do a refresher training, even if you just did one 2 months ago.
Absolutely, they should get training upon joining the team, and then yearly, because threats change yearly. I mean, think about how at one point it seemed like ransomware was everywhere because it was successful in a couple places, and then it spread like wildfire, and now it's something else. So yes, absolutely, every year, and document it and make sure that you can prove it if you're requested or if you have to go to trial.
And that's an excellent point, Scott, and one I think a lot of organizations miss is documenting their training program and when they attend training and who attended it.
Another one, is there a template that contains the minimum details required to capture for risk assessments?
It can be different for each organization based on your needs, but the NIST documents that we mentioned here are excellent and have that granular, here's some minimum requirements you would want to look at. So I would refer back to that NIST document, certainly.
Okay, and one more for now. Someone said they're looking not just at application security, they're also starting to bring research, tech, and facilities teams where shop floor equipment exists. Is anyone else expanding beyond IT, is their question.
Jenna, do you want to opine on that?
Yeah. I mean, if you're asking if anyone else is expanding their sort of holistic approach to risk from all areas of their organization, I would say we're seeing a lot of that across all industries, not just IT, and not just focused on what kind of firewalls do we have, what kind of antivirus. We're not focused on only the technical controls for the information systems. We really have to focus on everything else within our organization. The requirements have become so stringent, and because we do things in such a fast-paced way, that it's constantly sort of a battle of keeping up with what are the new requirements and what do we have to upgrade in our training and our systems. And so it really benefits an organization to have everybody from the janitorial staff all the way up to the C levels fully trained on security at this point, to protect the data and the assets of the organization, to protect the brand itself.
I have seen it primarily, again, coming from the defense sector, have seen it throughout the entire organization. So there's a lot of precedence there. As far as the civilian world, typically where I see it is in product management, where if they're developing, for example, a iOS or Android app, that there's the idea of doing an audit or an assessment and baking in security into that before it ever is allowed to see the light of day. So that's where I've seen it expanded to. But I think the idea that it's going to a shop floor is brilliant. I commend that and hope that others will copy that.
Me too. Go to the next one. Okay, so one of the things that if you are just now starting sort of your own risk assessment process and you're a little overwhelmed with how much there is to do, what I always recommend to all of our clients is start with the smallest component, the data, right? Because this is often one of our most important components within our organization. Where does it come into your network? What do you do with it? Who do you send it out to? What third parties, what vendors might have it? How do you store it? What are you using it for? All of these things are important. So if you've never captured data flow diagrams within your organization, I highly recommend this be one of the first exercises you start working on to really make sure you know where your data is coming from, or if you're processing data, what you're doing with it and making sure that it is secure for every point that you have it. This is something that I think more organizations need to catch up a little bit on, at least in the private sector from what we see, as opposed to the federal system. Scott, what is your take on this?
Yes, absolutely. This is crucial. And in fact, it gets paired up very nicely with the next slide, which I believe is the data inventory. So this is a data inventory piece of it. And this is something that I worked on. This is a real data inventory that I worked on when I was with Robert Half Legal. And essentially, it's the data flow diagram, but written, if you will. So it's all the text. It's what is the application? Why do you have it? What's the personal or the sensitive information that's included? In this case, I put this in the red box, the different things. And what's so valuable about this is that when you do a data protection impact assessment, which is just a species of risk assessment, you're going to use this as the foundation for that. So you can see how when you do all of this work, when you do the data flow diagram, when you do the data inventory, this is all the foundation for larger risk assessments, and it just becomes these building blocks, and you continue to develop and develop, and that's how you build a larger risk assessment, and you support it by showing these reference documents here. So, Jenna, your thoughts about this? I'm sure you've come across similar documents.
Absolutely, and this is such a critical undertaking for an organization to really inventory its data. A lot of times it's much like when we look around our house and we say, how did we get so much stuff, right? It's the same with your data, and we have to change the way we look at data. We shouldn't have it if we don't have a legitimate business need for it. We used to hang on to it because maybe it might be relevant, or maybe we could use it in the future, or things like that. But if you don't have it, it can't be stolen from you, right? So ultimately, you want to only have the data that you absolutely have to do business, and really no more than that. And then after you know, okay, we've cut down all the data that we have, really identifying it and digging into what type of data it is and how do we need to preserve and protect this type of data will help strengthen your organization as a whole, and will meet the compliance requirements of a lot of these legislation pieces or things like GDPR. Another way to help you with identifying sort of what data do you have and how important is each type of data that you have is you can do things like heat maps. You want to make sure that you have a key to kind of identify how critical it is, or how likely is it that we're going to have to put more controls on this type of data when we're talking about personal information or trade secrets or things like that. Certainly those hold more weight and more need to be protected than the information we put out publicly on our website. So kind of getting an overview of the data and identifying those points, those critical points where we really have to drill in and protect whatever that type of data is critical for your organizations to meet compliance requirements. Scott, what are your thoughts here?
Thoughts are that this is an ideal for presentation to the board or to senior management. And I can tell you, if you want your projects funded, this is the tool that you need. I've sat on many of these presentations trying to get funding, and I can tell you when the board sees all of these different areas of concern and how important they are, the light goes on. And this is how you're going to get funded. So if you have the opportunity, build a heat map. It's well worth your time. You would be amazed at how the results get, especially when you have lots of red in your heat map. That tends to get the board's attention.
Absolutely, absolutely it does. And it gives you a really good idea of sort of what you're dealing with. Definitely. Okay, we can go to the next slide, Abby. So when we talked about risk assessments, there are a couple of different types that you can look at. You can look at assessments like vulnerability assessments, which are often automated tools that are used to scan your systems and your networks and help to find those weak points, those vulnerabilities that may exist, so we can shore those up, hopefully, before they're ever exploited. There's not a lot of manual exploitation going on in a vulnerability assessment. It's really just looking for and identifying vulnerabilities. So these are things that you can incorporate into your organization on a very regular basis to make sure you stay in a healthy security posture. And if we go on to the next slide, after you've done those, you can also combine that with things like penetration tests, which are a little more invasive into your systems. Not only do we find the vulnerabilities, but then we're going to try to actually exploit them very much like a hacker would. And we will certainly point out, okay, this is what we were able to do, this is how we were able to get in. So it allows you to fill or close those windows, as I like to say, in the house so that nobody can get in, right? The objective isn't to punish your organization or to point out things that you've overlooked. It's definitely to help you get ahead of the game and prevent anybody else from getting into your systems that you don't want. On the next slide, if we go to that one, you can see that it's important whenever we do any kind of assessment, whether it's a vulnerability assessment or a penetration test, that you look at the risk rating for each type of finding, because they're not all the same. And certainly anything that's a critical or a high-level risk presents certain challenges to your organization that need to be remediated very quickly. So those are the type of things that you're going to want to start working on immediately. And certainly you'll work your way down the entire list, but focusing on those critical vulnerabilities as quickly as possible also helps to strengthen your security posture and prevent those data breaches that we don't want to have to have within our organization. And on the next slide, one type of testing or assessment that sometimes gets overlooked within many organizations is social engineering tests. We all talk about phishing campaigns and how we pretty much know how those work, but they constantly tweak and modify campaigns because they know everybody knows how they work. So we'll change tactics so that we can still try to have the good tried and true methods work for us, and delivering social engineering awareness training to your personnel is an excellent idea, but you should also follow that up with tests to see if they're actually paying attention to the training or if maybe some different training might be warranted. Scott, your thoughts on any of those types of testing?
Yes, in fact, I like to tell my clients that the best information security control ever invented is an alert employee. And so it goes back to the training discussion you and I had earlier about defeating phishing attacks and other kinds of insidious attacks by just frequent training and getting feedback from employees, creating a hotline or creating a central point where people can call and about questions about either potential incidents, about just questions about security or privacy. That's critical, because if one person owns that, then you have a very good idea of what's going on within your organization, and you can prevent problems before they get to be too big.
Absolutely, absolutely. And another type of risk assessment that you're going to want to do on the next slide is an audit. You know, and this goes back to the WISP itself, to the written information that we have within our organization. There are organizations out there like the Center for Internet Security, which has an excellent audit tool that any organization could go in and download for free. It is the 20 security controls that they use to help secure information systems. And number one and number two are know what's on your network as far as hardware goes, and know what's on your network as far as software goes. It starts at that level and it builds all the way out through other controls that you can put into place to really protect your system. The first 6 controls, though, are definitely the ones you want to focus on. If you can become fully compliant with the first 6 controls of these 20 security controls, you can remediate about 85 to 90% of the vulnerabilities in your network and prevent a lot of attacks just from those 6. But it's important whenever you're using their spreadsheet, to check off how you stack up against their controls, your compliance level, that you really not only look at where you're doing well. Here on this one, you can see controls 10 and 15, we're at 100%, but we focus on the gaps that we have nothing. There are several controls here that just are not being met. Those are the ones you really want to take a good critical look at, because clearly there is something within your information security program that's missing that we need to focus on and apply some work towards to become fully compliant. So this is where this can definitely help out any organization, help to become more compliant with these regulations, is just by following something like this, industry best practices from the Center for Internet Security. We can go to the next slide. Yep, another one is, we talked about GDPR. In GDPR, we're still seeing clients coming to us that are just now really thinking that perhaps they should start focusing on GDPR compliance, even though it's been live for a little bit. And it is quite a daunting task when you read through all 99 articles and you take a look at it. What you'll want to do is really break down the components mentioned in the 99 articles and create yourself a GDPR compliance roadmap. You can't flip a switch and become compliant overnight, but you can map out everything you're going to need to do within your organization, like develop training programs, like capturing more documentation if you're missing breach notification procedures or things of that nature, and then map out who's going to do it, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it. Scott, what are your thoughts from your perspective on organizations that are still kind of struggling to get up to full compliance with GDPR?
Well, I can tell you that the challenges that we're seeing state level GDPR, so CCPA being the latest version of that and more are on the way, in terms of how you address this, the mechanism is always the same. It's always going to be doing that assessment, prioritizing the things that you really want to fix first and can justify the budget for. And I can tell you, using those heat maps, which we showed earlier, to be able to get the budget to get the wheels turning is crucial. And I realize that you can't do everything all at once. You don't have to. Find the things that you can fix first and that are high priority, especially things that deal with respect to third parties. Address those first. I guarantee that will close a lot of open doors and will really help your security posture overall. And then document everything. Document all the good things you've done. because if something does go wrong, you can show all the efforts you put into place that make your efforts reasonable, and I use that in air quotes here, that you'll use in court if you need to defend yourself.
Absolutely. And everything that you have in progress, too, is important to be documenting as you're going, because if you are audited right in the middle, at least you have everything you've already completed and everything that you are working on to show that you're making a concerted effort to become compliant. All right, Abby, we can go to the next one. All right.
It's not going to come as a huge surprise. What goes into a WISP? These are things that you probably have all expected. So the different species of policies, basic policies, whether it's acceptable use, data classification, your basic security policy, all of these are going to be components of it. But also your procedures, above and beyond the procedures that you're all familiar with, you're going to find that addressing inquiries from regulatory or law enforcement agencies, that's critical. Who should get that? Should it go to legal immediately? Should it go to the CISO? Should it go to both? And what happens if they're not available? There should be a chain of authority so that you have an idea of who gets notified first. This is all part of procedures, and this is something that really I see get left out. You'll get all these great policies and basic procedures, but a lot of times when there's a crisis, it's not clear who should tackle things first. Then your plans, incident response and breach notification, are separate plans, and I'm sure there's other kinds that you're familiar with, but these are two that are very germane, especially in the breach notification area. And then finally, sign off from leadership. Again, as I said earlier on, if there's not sign up for leadership, essentially acknowledging responsibility and putting their imprimatur on the plan, then I'm not sure if it's serious. So these are things I've seen. Jen, I'm sure you've seen others as well.
Absolutely. And some of the other types of risk assessment, like your penetration tests and your vulnerability assessments, can help corroborate all your efforts here. You know, it will help back up the fact that you are encrypting your data, that you are storing it appropriately, you're following your own secure data disposal policies and handling policies and things of that nature. And when we talk about risk from an organization level, one of the main reasons you've got to make sure you have that senior management buy-in is also because they're ultimately responsible for the risk of their organization. So they have to sign off on it, accepting whatever your current risk level is. So it's very important to have it be part of your information security program.
Let's talk about the final takeaways here from our discussion, and we'll take more questions. Two that are important to me, certainly, is assembling your team. It's not going to be just the auditors. It's going to also be either just IT proper or IT security, but you're also going to involve your lines of business that are affected by this. So if you are a manufacturing company, then you're going to likely have managers for every line of business that are responsible for delivering shipments on time and so forth. Getting them involved early is crucial. Project managers or program managers, typically it's program managers, that say, for example, you've got an ongoing program and this is something that the program is going to be affected by the audit and potentially all of the plans here, and these people are not looped in. They're not going to be able to help you if something goes wrong. So you want to get these folks in and get in early. And speaking of getting in early, get legal involved early. I can't tell you how many times that I've had clients bring things to me right before they have to be signed, and there's really not a lot I can do. So if someone says, oh, is this WISP adequate for this supply chain requirement? And I can see the requirement's absurd. It's requiring, for example, the entire organization to sign off on these standards instead of the business unit involved, which basically means your entire organization has to be certified under one of the NIST or the ISO standards. Guess what? Now you either have the choice of signing off on behalf of your entire organization, something you can't do, or turning away business. And that's something that legal could address early on, but when you bring it to them at the last moment, there's not a lot we can do. So do get them involved early. And Jen, I'm sure you have some points you want to address as well.
Yeah, legal's participation is critical. Earlier is better, but also make sure you're going through and doing it periodically throughout. Again, as we talked about those legal contractual assessments, right? Having them look at that, because if we start to slip out of our security posture, the legal department or your legal team is going to be the one that's going to help you correct that course. So you definitely want them involved pretty much throughout everything. And the way we do business now has changed so dramatically that the physical jurisdictional boundaries don't exist for us anymore. So it's not enough to just say, well, you know, I get people from all over, so I really don't know who I need to comply with, so I'm just going to do what I'm doing and continue, you know, conducting business as usual. You may have to comply. with many different state or country regulations. So you really want to take a good hard look at that, consult with your legal team, and when in doubt, I say shoot for the most stringent regulations, because then you'll meet everything underneath it. Remember that WISPs are formal documented programs, and they're really designed to reduce risk for your organization and focus very heavily on protecting the data that you have, use, or create. Lastly, you really have to take a look at the risks throughout your entire organization, not just to your information systems, not just to maybe your personnel, throughout every single aspect of your organization, in order to really create the correct security documentation, the right policies, the right procedures, and implement the right security controls. If you look at it from that perspective, it will cost you less money, less time, and reduce the likelihood that you're going to end up in some sort of litigious action for failure to comply. Those would be my takeaways.
I think that's it, Abby. We still have about 5 minutes for questions. Are there any remaining questions?
Yes, there are. This one's for Jana. Where can attendees find the list of the top 20 security controls that you covered?
If you go to the Center for Internet Security's website, they have several resources out there for the 20 security controls, including a very handy spreadsheet that you can turn into an audit tool for your own organization. You just have to put in your name and your organization's email address, and then you can access pretty much any of their tools for you.
Great. I believe that's all the questions that we have at this time. So I wanted to say thank you all again for joining us today. Again, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and a link to the webinar recording will be provided in the coming days. A huge thank you to Scott and Jana for an excellent presentation. Thank you guys so much for everything today. And we hope to see everyone at future webinars. Thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much.